Alia had been living in the slave market for what felt like a lifetime. Every day, she was paraded in front of potential buyers, aliens of all shapes and sizes, who would bid for her like she was nothing more than a piece of merchandise. It wasn't always like this. She remembered a time when she was free, running through the fields of her home planet, her laughter carried by the wind. That was before the invaders came, before they destroyed her peaceful world and captured her people. Now, Alia stood in the crowded market, her eyes downcast, too tired to hope. She had seen too many of her kind sold off, their fates unknown. Some were taken to be forced laborers. Others, she knew, were treated even worse. She had heard the whispers, the rumors. Some people were never seen again. Alia's skin, a soft shade of green, was marked with tattoos that identified her as a member of the once great Chera tribe. Her long, dark hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes, usually filled with curiosity and joy, had lost their spark. They were dull now, filled only with fear and resignation. The chains around her wrists were heavy, cold metal that reminded her every moment that she was not free. The market was a chaotic place, bustling with strange alien species from across the galaxy. Some were large and intimidating, others small and agile, but all were here for one purpose: to buy, sell, and trade beings like Alia. She stood in a cage, her head lowered as she waited for the next auction to begin. She had seen the way the buyers looked at her. They saw nothing but a commodity, a tool to be used for their own gain. It was the same every day. Sometimes they would speak to her, trying to convince her to make herself useful. Other times they would simply watch her in silence, as if studying her for some unknown purpose. Today the market was more crowded than usual. A new group of buyers had arrived, and they were eyeing her cage with interest. Alia's heart sank. She didn't want to go to another cruel master. She had heard rumors of someone cruel, who had been buying slaves recently. The thought of being sold to him made her sick. But as she looked around, she saw something different. A man, a human, standing near the back of the crowd. He wasn't like the others. Most of the buyers were aliens, but this man had the look of someone who didn't belong here. He was tall, dressed in a simple, worn uniform, and his eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd with purpose. He looked different, like he was out of place. Alia's curiosity, something she had buried long ago, stirred within her. She found herself wondering why he was there. What was his purpose? Was he just another buyer, or was he something else? She couldn't tell, but for a brief moment, a flicker of hope sparked in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, he would be different. The auctioneer, a gruff, reptilian creature, stepped forward, signaling for the next lot to be presented. Alia was shoved forward by a guard, her chains rattling with each step. The crowd murmured in anticipation as she was paraded in front of them, her face expressionless, her posture stiff. The human man stepped forward, his gaze focused on Alia. He looked at her not with the cold, calculating eyes of a buyer, but with something else, something that she couldn't place. It was almost as if he was seeing her as a person, not just an object to be owned. This only confused her more. Was he going to buy her, or was he here to do something else? As the auctioneer began to speak, offering her up for sale, Alia's heart beat faster. She tried to remain calm, but her mind raced. She had seen the way people like her were treated once they were sold. She didn't want that. She couldn't endure more of it. Her people had been broken by the invaders, and she had already suffered too much. The human man spoke suddenly, his voice low but firm. How much for her? His voice cut through the noise of the crowd, surprising everyone. The auctioneer turned to him, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. The bidding started as usual, with the usual buyers calling out offers. But the human man didn't flinch. He stood still, watching, as if he was making a decision. Alia felt something stir within her. A strange feeling. Fear, yes, but also a strange sense of hope. She had to stop herself from showing it. She couldn't afford to be hopeful. Hope had betrayed her too many times before. The bidding grew higher and higher, but the man didn't seem to care about the price. It was clear to Ilya that he wasn't here for the same reasons as the others. And then, just when the bidding reached its peak, the human man did something unexpected. He stepped forward, pulled out a small device from his pocket, and pressed it to the auctioneer's face. The auctioneer's eyes widened in surprise, but the man didn't wait for a response. "You'll give her to me now." "No more bidding," he said, his tone calm but unyielding. The crowd fell silent. No one dared to challenge him. The auctioneer hesitated, then nodded. Ilya's heart stopped for a moment. She couldn't believe what was happening. Was this really happening? Was she really being freed? The chains that had bound her for so long felt heavier now, and she looked at the man, unsure of what to do. "Come with me," the man said softly, his voice a gentle command. He held out his hand. For the first time in years, Ilya allowed herself to hope. Ilya couldn't believe it. The man who had just freed her from her chains wasn't like anyone she had ever met. He wasn't an alien. He was human, something she had only heard about in passing from other slaves. She had always thought of humans as distant, strange creatures from another part of the galaxy, but now she was standing in front of one, and he was offering her freedom. She stared at him for a long moment, unsure of what to do. The sounds of the crowded market continued around her, but they felt far away, muffled by the racing of her heart. She had been a prisoner for so long that trusting someone seemed impossible. And yet there was something about the man's voice, his calm yet firm manner, that made her hesitate for just a moment. Maybe he was different. Maybe he wasn't like the others. "You're free now," the human said, his voice gentle yet strong. "Come with me if you want to leave this place." The words were like a spark to dry tinder. Ilya's breath caught in her throat. She had heard the word free countless times in her dreams, but it always felt so far away. Now it was right in front of her, so close that she could almost touch it. She took a small step back, her feet shuffling on the ground. The chains that once held her felt lighter now, but there was a different kind of weight on her shoulders, the weight of uncertainty, the weight of freedom. Could she really trust this human? What if he was like all the others, just another person who would use her, who would leave her in another cruel situation? Before she could second-guess herself, the human raised his hand in a calming gesture. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to feel trapped. I'm here to help." Ilya glanced around, her eyes darting between the man and the chaos of the market. The guards had started to shout and rush toward them, realizing that something had gone wrong. The auctioneer was already barking orders, but the human didn't flinch. He stood firm, his gaze focused entirely on Ilya. The man was tall, with short, dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to be always thinking, always calculating. His clothes were simple, a uniform of sorts, though it looked worn and well-traveled. His presence was commanding without being threatening, and there was something in his posture that made her believe he would protect her, even if he didn't have to. Without another word, the human began to walk briskly toward the nearest exit. He didn't wait for Ilya to follow. He moved as though he was certain she would come along. Ilya hesitated for a moment, but then her feet seemed to move on their own. It was as though her body knew what her heart wanted even before her mind could fully process it. The moment she started walking, she felt something shift inside her. It was as though a door had opened, and she was stepping into a world that felt unfamiliar but full of possibility. For the first time in years, she wasn't shackled by chains or locked in a cage. She was walking freely, following someone who seemed to be offering her a chance to escape. The market was chaotic. Aliens and humans alike were shouting, trying to figure out what had just happened. Ilya could hear footsteps behind them, and she knew that the guards were closing in fast. The human man didn't look back. He simply kept moving forward, leading her through narrow alleyways and winding paths. As they moved deeper into the city's underbelly, Ilya could feel her anxiety building. They were running, but where were they going? What was his plan? She opened her mouth to ask, But the human turned his head slightly and spoke before she could say anything. "Don't worry," he said. "We're almost there. I've got a way out. You just have to trust me." His voice was calm and reassuring, but Alia couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. The guards would be searching for them, and the streets were already filling with people who might try to stop them. The human had a plan, but was it enough? Just as she was about to speak, they turned a corner and came to a small hidden door in the side of a building. The human pulled out a small device from his pocket, pressed a button, and the door clicked open. Alia's eyes widened. She had never seen a door like this, so secretive, so secure. The man motioned for her to go inside. "This way," he said, his voice still steady. Alia hesitated, glancing back toward the busy street, but the sounds of the pursuit were growing closer. Without another thought, she stepped inside the hidden doorway. The human followed behind her, quickly shutting the door just as the first of the guards appeared down the street. Inside, the air was cooler, and the walls were made of metal. It felt like a safe house of some kind, though Alia couldn't tell what exactly it was. She looked at the human, who was now checking a series of monitors on the far wall. He seemed at ease, even though they had just narrowly escaped. He was in control of the situation. "Who are you?" Alia finally asked, her voice shaking a little from the adrenaline. "Why did you help me?" The human turned to face her, his eyes softening. "I'm James," he said, "and I couldn't just leave you there. No one should live like that." Alia stared at him, confused but grateful. She had never met anyone who cared about her freedom, let alone someone who would risk his life to help her. "But why?" she asked again. "I don't understand. Why would a human care about me?" James smiled, though it was a small, weary smile. "Because I've seen enough suffering to know what it means to be free, and because I couldn't walk away and do nothing." Alia didn't know what to say. She had never known someone like him, someone who saw her as more than a prisoner. But for the first time in years, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was hope. Inside the hidden room, Alia took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing of her heart. She could still hear the faint sounds of chaos outside, but the thick walls of the safe house muffled most of it. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the technology that filled the room. There were screens, blinking lights, and various equipment she didn't understand, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that she was no longer in that dreadful market. James had already started working on a console on the far wall. His fingers moved quickly over the controls, and his face was focused, a look of determination set on his features. Alia could see that he was the kind of person who didn't waste time. He was making sure they wouldn't be followed. "Are we safe here?" she asked, her voice quiet but anxious. She felt out of place, as though she didn't belong in such a clean, well-lit room. She had spent so many years in the dirt and shadows of the market that this place felt strange to her. James didn't look at her as he typed on the console. "For now," he said, "but we can't stay here too long. We'll need to keep moving." Alia nodded. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but the reality of the situation was sinking in. She was free, yes, but freedom didn't come without danger. She knew that. She had heard stories of people who had escaped slavery, only to be caught again. The thought of being dragged back to that place made her stomach churn. But something in James' eyes made her believe that he wasn't just going to leave her to her fate. He was different. He had freed her when he didn't have to. And now he was helping her find a way out. A part of her wanted to believe that there was still good in the galaxy, despite everything she had seen. "Where are we going?" she asked softly, finally gathering the courage to speak again. James looked up from the console, his eyes locking with hers. "There's a ship waiting for us," he said. "It's not far. We'll get out of the city, then figure out the next step from there." Alia's heart skipped a beat. A ship. She had seen ships in the market. Massive, imposing vessels that carried the slaves to their new owners. But this ship was different. It wasn't a vessel for transporting people like her. It was their escape. James moved towards the door, and pressed a small button beside it. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and he motioned for Elia to follow. She hesitated for a moment, but then stepped forward. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was ready to leave everything behind. They slipped out of the safe house into the dimly lit streets. The air outside was cool, and the city felt eerily quiet compared to the market. Elia kept her head down, walking quickly behind James. He led the way, his steps steady, like he knew exactly where he was going. As they made their way through narrow alleyways and quiet side streets, Elia found herself looking around, unsure of what to expect. She had been to many different parts of the city during her time as a slave, but she had never been allowed to explore on her own. Every place she had been taken to had been a prison in its own way. "This way," James said, breaking her thoughts. He turned down a narrow alley, and Elia followed, staying close behind. They reached the end of the alley, where a small, sleek ship was hidden in the shadows. It was nothing like the huge cargo ships she had seen in the market. This ship was fast, designed for quick escapes, not for hauling goods or prisoners. James walked towards it and quickly accessed a hidden control panel beside the ship. The door slid open with a smooth motion, and he stepped inside. Elia hesitated for only a moment before following him. Inside, the ship was small but comfortable. There were several seats lined up along the walls, a small control area at the front, and the soft hum of the ship's engine already starting. Elia felt a strange mix of emotions as she sat down in one of the seats. She had always dreamed of being free, of escaping the life she had been forced to live. But now that it was happening, she wasn't sure what to feel. Everything was so different from what she had known. James settled into the seat next to her and tapped a few buttons on the control panel. "Buckle up," he said, his voice calm. "We'll be out of here in a minute." Elia nodded and did as he instructed, strapping herself into the seat. As the ship's engines began to roar to life, she glanced out the small window, watching the city fade into the distance. The tall buildings and crowded streets disappeared, replaced by the dark expanse of space ahead. She leaned back in her seat, feeling the weight of the situation sink in. She was free. But where would she go? What would she do? She had no family, no home to return to. She was alone in the galaxy. But then she looked over at James, who was focused on piloting the ship. He wasn't her enemy. He had risked everything to save her. Maybe, just maybe, this man would be her guide through this uncertain new life. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but full of emotion, "for saving me. I don't know how to repay you." James glanced over at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You don't have to repay me," he said. "Just stay alive. That's enough for me." Elia was silent for a moment, taking in his words. She wasn't sure how to feel about him yet, but there was something about the way he spoke that made her believe he truly wanted to help her. The ship shot through the sky, leaving the city far behind. Elia closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself relax. She had no idea where they were going, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was finally heading somewhere better. The ship sped through the stars, its engines humming softly as they left the city far behind. Elia stared out of the small window, watching as the lights of the planet faded into the endless black of space. She had been so close to losing everything. Now she was free, no longer a prisoner, no longer trapped in the dark markets where people like her were sold. She turned to look at James, who was piloting the ship with steady hands. He had barely spoken since they had left the planet, but his calm demeanor gave her a sense of comfort. He seemed confident, like he knew what he was doing. And for a moment, Elia allowed herself to relax, trusting that he would get them to safety. "How long until we reach the next planet?" Elia finally asked, breaking the silence. James glanced at her, his eyes warm but tired. "It'll take a few hours. We'll stop on a neutral station to rest and get some supplies." Elia nodded, unsure of what to expect. She had never been to a space station before, and the thought of stepping into a new place one where she was free, filled her with a mix of excitement and nervousness. She had been living in fear for so long that she wasn't sure how to behave in this new world, where she was no longer just a slave. She had so many questions, but she wasn't sure where to start. What would happen now? What would her life look like? She had no family left. Her people had been scattered, lost in the chaos of the invasion. She felt like a stranger in her own galaxy. James seemed to sense her unease. "You don't have to have all the answers right away," he said. "You've been through a lot. You're free now, and that's all that matters for the moment." Elia smiled faintly, grateful for his words. He was right. She didn't need to have everything figured out right now. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to worry about surviving day to day. She was free, and that was the first step toward something better. As the hours passed, Elia found herself growing more comfortable in the ship. The walls were sleek and clean, and the seats were surprisingly soft. She had spent so many years in harsh conditions that even the simplest comforts felt like luxuries. She stood up after a while and made her way to the small galley area in the back of the ship. It was simple, with just a few shelves and a small stove, but it was enough for their needs. She rummaged through the supplies and found some bread and fruit. It wasn't much, but it would do. James glanced at her from his seat at the control panel. "Want some?" he asked, motioning toward the small table. Elia hesitated for a moment before nodding. She wasn't used to sharing meals, especially with someone who had helped her escape. But James had been kind to her from the start, and she didn't want to shut herself off from him. She brought the food over to the table and sat down. "Thank you for everything," she said quietly, looking up at him. "I don't know how I can repay you." James smiled softly as he took a bite of the bread. "You don't have to," he said. "Just make sure you take care of yourself. That's all I ask." Elia felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She had never met anyone who spoke to her so simply, with so little expectation. It made her feel like maybe she wasn't completely alone after all. The ship's engines hummed steadily as they continued their journey through the stars. Elia found herself lost in thought, her mind drifting back to the life she had left behind. She remembered her home planet, green fields, clear skies, and the warmth of the sun on her skin. She remembered the laughter of her people, their songs and dances that had once filled the air. Now all of that was gone. Her people were gone, scattered or enslaved by the invaders. She was the last of her kind, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on her heart. James seemed to sense the change in her mood. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," he said gently. "But if you ever feel like sharing, I'm here to listen." Elia looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. She didn't know how to explain everything she had lost, but she realized that maybe, for the first time in years, she didn't have to carry it all alone. "I lost everything," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "My home, my people. I don't know where to go from here." James was silent for a moment, giving her space to speak. Then he turned to her, his expression serious but kind. "You don't have to know everything right now, but you're not alone anymore. You have a chance to rebuild, to find a new path, and I'll help you, if you want." Elia felt something stir in her chest, a faint glimmer of hope. Maybe she could rebuild. Maybe there was a future for her, even after everything she had lost. It was hard to believe, but as she looked at James, she realized that maybe this was the beginning of something new. The ship continued its journey through the vastness of space, and Elia felt her thoughts settle. She didn't know where she was going yet, but she knew she wasn't alone anymore. She had been given a second chance, a chance to start over. And no matter what the future held, she was ready to face it. The days aboard the small ship seemed to pass quickly. Elia spent much of her time looking out of the window at the stars, contemplating everything she had left behind and everything that lay ahead. Space stretched out before her, vast and endless. It felt like she was floating in a new world, one where she didn't have to fear for her life every second. But as much as she felt the freedom, she also felt the weight of uncertainty. She had no idea where she was going or what kind of life awaited her. All she knew was that she was no longer a slave, and that was both a blessing and a curse. She could no longer live in the shadow of the life she had once known, but the future was still unknown. James, on the other hand, seemed like he had everything under control. He was quiet but steady, keeping the ship on course as they traveled through the endless void of space. He never showed signs of stress, always focused on the task at hand. It was clear to Ilya that he had done this before. He was experienced and knew how to navigate the galaxy. One morning, after several days of travel, Ilya was sitting in the small galley, sipping on some water, when James walked in. He was holding a small device in his hand, and there was a serious look on his face. "We'll be arriving at the station soon," he said, his voice calm. "We need to stop there for fuel and supplies. It's not the safest place, but it's neutral ground. We'll be okay." Ilya nodded, her fingers tightening around her glass. She was getting used to the idea of traveling, but the thought of stopping at a station made her nervous. She didn't know what to expect from a place like that. Would people recognize her as a former slave? Would she be safe? She couldn't let her guard down. "Will there be a lot of people there?" she asked, trying to mask the uncertainty in her voice. James looked at her for a moment before answering. "There will be a mix of people. Some will be traders, some will be travelers. It's a busy place, but it's not a slave market or anything like that. I'll be with you the whole time. We'll stick together." Ilya wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. She trusted James, but she couldn't help feeling like she was stepping into the unknown once again. The station would be their first real test of whether or not she could truly live in this new world. The ship grew closer to the station, and the stars outside began to take on a different shape. The station was a massive structure, floating in space, its many levels and platforms sprawling out in all directions. It looked like a small city, with lights flashing and ships docking at all hours. It was a place of trade, a place where different species came and went, exchanging goods and services. As they docked, James powered down the ship's engines and turned to Ilya. "Stay close to me," he said softly. "We'll head to the supply area first. Don't talk to anyone unless I tell you to." Ilya nodded, her heart racing. She followed James out of the ship and into the crowded docking bay. The air was filled with the sounds of ships arriving and departing, and the scent of oil and metal lingered in the air. People were everywhere, alien traders in brightly colored clothes, travelers in simple uniforms, and workers hustling between the ships. Ilya kept her head down, staying close to James as they navigated the busy spaceport. She was trying to avoid drawing attention to herself, but it wasn't easy. The hustle and bustle of the station were overwhelming, and she felt out of place. James led her to a small shop near the supply area. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and they entered. The interior was dimly lit, with shelves stocked with various goods, food, tools, and other supplies. The shopkeeper, a short alien with 4 arms, looked up from behind the counter and gave them a nod. "We need fuel, food, and anything else you have for travel," James said in a neutral tone. The shopkeeper didn't ask questions, merely nodding and moving to gather the requested items. Ilya stood quietly beside James, trying to blend into the background. She wasn't used to this kind of life. The simplicity of it, the idea that she could buy things, that she could walk freely and make choices, it felt both exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. As they left the shop with their supplies, James turned to her. "We'll be here for a little while longer. If you need anything, we can come back later." Ilya nodded, feeling the weight of the new world around her. She was free, yes, but freedom came with a price. She had to learn how to live again, how to be a person in a galaxy that had once only seen her as property. The two of them wandered through the station for a while, with James pointing out different areas and explaining things as they went. Elia couldn't help but be amazed by the different species she saw. Aliens of all shapes, sizes, and colors. She had never seen so many different beings in one place. It was overwhelming, but also strangely beautiful. As they made their way back toward the docking bay, Elia began to feel a sense of acceptance. She wasn't completely comfortable yet, but she was starting to see that the world was bigger than she had imagined. There was more out there than the cruel markets and the chains that had once bound her. James glanced at her, noticing the change in her expression. "You're doing good," he said with a reassuring smile. "I know it's a lot to take in, but you'll get used to it." Elia gave him a small smile in return. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she wasn't alone. She had James, and that meant everything. As the ship lifted off the station, and they once again set course for the stars, Elia felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a new life in this vast galaxy. The days spent on the station had given Elia time to adjust, but her heart still felt heavy. The vastness of space was beautiful, yet it was also a reminder of how much she had lost. She had been given a second chance at life, but the future was still uncertain. Every new place felt like a new beginning, but also a new challenge. She didn't know what was ahead, but she couldn't afford to look back. James had been patient with her, offering quiet support when she needed it. She had come to trust him more over the past few days. He never pushed her to talk or explain too much, but he was always there when she had questions or when something felt unfamiliar. His presence was a comfort, even if she didn't fully understand him. He was her guide through this strange new world, and she was grateful for it. On the fourth day after leaving the station, the ship began to slow down. Elia looked up from her seat by the window, her curiosity piqued. They had been traveling for several days now, passing through different parts of space she had never seen before. She had no idea where they were headed, but it was clear from James's focused expression that this next stop was important. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. James turned to her, his face serious but calm. "We're going to a place called Core. It's a small colony, mostly independent. It's not as safe as other areas, but it's neutral. We'll be able to rest for a while and get supplies." Elia's heart skipped a beat. Core. She had heard rumors about that place, about how dangerous it could be. It was a place where smugglers, traders, and people who didn't want to be found gathered. It was a world that could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. "Is it safe?" she asked, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. James nodded. "It's safe enough. We won't stay long, and we'll keep a low profile. But it's a place where people can disappear if they need to. That might be useful for us." Elia wasn't sure if she should feel reassured or more anxious. She didn't want to put herself in danger again, but she also knew that this was part of the journey. She had to keep moving forward, even when she didn't know what was waiting for her. The ship approached the planet, and the landscape below came into view. Core was nothing like the clean, orderly stations they had visited before. The surface of the planet was covered in sprawling deserts and jagged mountains, with only a few scattered cities along the coasts. It looked wild and untamed, the kind of place where you had to rely on yourself if you wanted to survive. As they descended into the atmosphere, Elia could feel the tension in the air. She wasn't sure if it was her nerves or if the atmosphere of the planet itself was affecting her. She could sense that James was on high alert, his eyes scanning the controls, always making sure they were on the right path. The ship landed in a small, isolated area just outside of one of the larger settlements. The ground was dusty, and the buildings in the distance were small and weathered, their structures made of metal and stone. It didn't look like a place where people would welcome strangers, but it was exactly the kind of place they needed. James powered down the engines and turned to Elia. "Stay close to me," he said again, his tone serious. "Core might seem quiet, but things can change quickly here. We'll stick to the outskirts of the settlement, and only go into town if we have to." Elia nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She had learned to trust James's judgment, but the fear she felt was still there, lingering in the back of her mind. What if they weren't safe here? What if they were walking right into a trap? As they stepped off the ship and into the dry air, Elia pulled her coat tighter around her. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The wind carried a faint smell of dust and metal. She felt out of place, as though she didn't belong in this harsh, unforgiving world. James led her toward a small structure not far from the ship. It looked like a simple storage shed, but it was sturdy and secure. As they entered, Elia breathed a sigh of relief. It was quiet inside, the walls lined with crates and boxes of supplies. James immediately began checking through the crates, looking for anything they might need. Elia stood off to the side, watching him work. She had learned that he always had a plan, even if he didn't explain it right away. He didn't talk much, but his actions spoke louder than words. He was making sure they were ready for whatever came next. "Do you think we'll be safe here?" Elia asked, her voice hesitant. James paused for a moment, then looked up at her. "For now, but we'll need to stay vigilant. Core is a place where anything can happen. People don't trust easily, and you can't always tell who's friend and who's foe." Elia nodded, her stomach twisting with anxiety. She didn't want to be here, but she knew they had no choice. The ship needed repairs, and they needed supplies. The only way forward was through this unknown territory. James finished checking the crates and closed them up. He gave Elia a look that was both reassuring and serious. "We'll rest here for the night. Tomorrow, we'll head into the settlement and see what we can find. Stay close, and don't draw attention to yourself." Elia didn't answer right away. She was still processing everything: her escape, her new life, and the risks they were taking. But in that moment, as she stood beside James in the dimly lit storage shed, she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone anymore. And with James by her side, maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to survive this strange new world. The morning sun was harsh over Core, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. Elia stood outside the small storage shed, the dust swirling around her as the wind picked up. She could feel the weight of the air, dry and heavy, pressing against her skin. The planet was wild, untamed, and yet it felt like it was offering a new beginning. Still, every step forward came with the feeling that the world around her was constantly changing, and she couldn't predict what would happen next. James was already outside, checking the ship and making sure everything was secure for their trip into the settlement. He moved quickly and confidently, a man used to the constant hustle of surviving in unpredictable environments. Elia stood watching him for a moment, feeling the urge to ask him what came next, but she knew better than to push him for answers. She had learned that James didn't give away much about his past, and even less about his plans. But that was all right. She had a feeling that when he was ready, he would share. For now, all she needed to do was follow his lead. Elia brushed the dust off her jacket and took a deep breath. Today, they would go into the settlement. She had been nervous about it ever since they had landed on Core. This place was different from the stations they had visited before. It wasn't filled with travelers from all over the galaxy. It was a place where people went when they had nowhere else to turn. It was a place for those who wanted to hide, to disappear. The kinds of people she had spent years avoiding. James turned to her, his face focused, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "We're heading into town today. Stick close. Don't talk to anyone unless I tell you to. This place is dangerous if you don't know who to trust." Elia nodded. She had learned quickly that the advice James gave her was always worth listening to. She didn't know how to survive here on her own, but she trusted him to keep her safe. She had no choice but to trust him. They made their way to the settlement, moving quickly through the dusty landscape. As they neared the settlement, the sounds of life reached them, the hum of machinery, the voices of people, and the distant noise of ships docking. The closer they got, The more Elia felt a sense of tension in the air. This wasn't like the bustling station she had seen. There was an underlying feeling of unease, like anything could go wrong at any moment. When they reached the edge of the settlement, James stopped and surveyed the area. There were a few small buildings, their walls marked with wear and tear, and in the distance, Elia could see a bar and a few shops. People walked through the dusty streets, their faces guarded, their eyes scanning the surroundings with caution. James turned to Elia. "We'll stick to the outer parts for now. If anyone asks, we're just travelers passing through." "Got it." Elia nodded, her heart racing. She wasn't used to this kind of life, the constant need to be alert, the constant feeling that danger could be just around the corner. But she didn't have much choice. This was where they were, and she had to learn how to adapt. They walked into the settlement, keeping their heads down. Elia felt the weight of the stares of the people around them, their eyes following them as they passed. She didn't know if they saw her as a threat or just another outsider, but she felt the tension rising. It wasn't like the safety of the neutral stations where people went about their business. Here, everyone was watching. Everyone was on edge. James led her toward a small supply shop. As they entered, the cool air inside felt like a relief from the heat outside. The shelves were stacked with food, water, and other necessities. The shopkeeper, a tall man with a rough face, looked up from behind the counter, his expression unreadable. "Looking for something?" the man asked, his voice low. James stepped forward, giving the man a quick nod. "Just supplies for travel," he said, his tone casual. "Nothing special." Elia hung back, feeling out of place. She had never been in a shop like this before. Everything about it felt so different from the world she had known. She had spent so many years just surviving, never thinking about what it would be like to actually buy things, to live freely. And now, here she was, trying to find a way to fit into this strange new world. As James spoke to the shopkeeper, Elia couldn't help but notice a pair of men standing near the back of the shop. They were watching her closely, their eyes lingering a little too long. She tried to ignore them, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The tension she had felt in the settlement was growing stronger, like a storm waiting to break. James finished his conversation with the shopkeeper and turned to Elia. "Let's go," he said, his voice low but firm. They quickly left the shop, and as they stepped back into the street, Elia felt a wave of relief. But it was short-lived. As they walked down the narrow street, the two men from the shop appeared in front of them, blocking their path. One of them was holding something in his hand, a small device that buzzed with an unfamiliar energy. Elia's heart skipped a beat. She had seen enough in her life to know when something wasn't right. These men weren't just curious travelers. They were trouble. James immediately stepped in front of Elia, his posture tense, his hand resting near the weapon at his side. "We don't want any trouble," he said, his voice calm but firm. The man with the device sneered. "You're on core now. No one gets to walk around here without paying the price." His voice was gruff, filled with a dangerous edge. Elia could feel the situation escalating. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing. They needed to get out of here, and fast. James's voice was steady as he spoke again. "I said we don't want trouble. But if you're looking for a fight, you're going to regret it." Elia watched, her heart racing, unsure of what was going to happen next. The streets of Kor were about to test them in ways she had never imagined.